anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine milieu and what they've done since COVID. And the specific type of populist social movement that I suggest that these groups in Ireland would fit into is kind of a populist radical right form of social movements, because within the skepticism of lockdowns, of COVID, of vaccinations, you have layers of nativism and the sort of anti-state narratives that we sometimes see in these populist radical right movements. And many of the actors, as we shall see, are drawn from the populist radical right gene pool. So what's my approach? How am I actually looking at these groups? Well, I'm analysing online political ephemera that these groups have created, including websites, social media posts, live streams, electronic publications, flyers, and so on. And you can see one there, which gives you perhaps an indication of the political leanings of many in the anti-lockdown milieu. And I'm doing this as a sort of a form of online ethnography, and Winter and Lavis have kind of looked at this and sort of talked about the importance of listening in online ethnography. So I'll show you an example of some of my notes later on, where I try and listen to how the crowds interact in things like live streams with particular speakers at demonstrations and so on. I acknowledge that there are also ethical challenges with online ethnography, but what I'm looking at is all in the public domain. These groups talk about wanting to get the message out. They also talk about being pro-free speech. So I think it's legitimate to examine that public material and engage with it. And what I'm doing at the moment is trying to understand common narratives among and between these groups, both inside and outside Ireland. And so far, I think it's interesting to note that we see significant crossover between the material generated in Ireland and that generated in Britain. Even groups on the radical right in both contexts. You would imagine that these are not natural allies, but believe it or not, when you start looking at the materials coming out and the connections between the groups, you'll find that they are indeed quite closely tied. So what are these groups saying? Well, the narratives of the COVID skeptic milieus in Ireland revolve around sovereignty, and this idea that the individual and not the state is the sovereign. So they kind of link back to things like the sovereign citizens movement. You see a lot of similar discussions there, questioning the legal frameworks in which the state operates, talking about things like common law, and the idea that the state is not legitimate in essence. They are highly conspiratorial in many cases. The virus itself is often seen as a fake, a phony virus. The lockdowns as well in response to it are regarded as things that are planned by, in many cases, quote unquote, globalists as they see it. This is all linked to the World Economic Forum, Agenda 21, and some of the usual names you'd expect in conspiracy circles like George Soros, Bill Gates come up there as well. And so these agendas and individuals are often referenced by these groups. But what they do in the Irish context is sort of tap into that historical narrative that's common among traditional Irish Republicans, those particularly who maybe would have believed that physical force was legitimate and still legitimate after independence, that the Irish state lacked legitimacy, that there's only one legitimate parliament, and that was the first parliament, the first Dáil of 1919, and that everything else after that has been illegitimate. And that's, if you like, the emotional pull that they use to try and attract people in. And so the idea is if Parliament lacks legitimacy, then so too do its laws, and therefore so too do the COVID restrictions. Very similar to the Reich citizens in Germany, as Buchmeier has discussed in a very good chapter on that subject. So they draw on these narratives of individual sovereignty and illegitimacy of the state. So who are these players in the Irish context? Well, they kind of divide into two main groups. You have these kind of avowedly apolitical groups. They claim that they're not necessarily looking at things from particular political slants, but you can tell by the names and some of them that they probably do draw on a sort of political repertoire that might be seen elsewhere. So you have groups like Yellow Vest Ireland, Health Freedom Ireland, which was more of a sort of a grassroots organisation, and Rise Up Éireann, which kind of came out against lockdown, and they claim to be apolitical, just opposing these public health restrictions. With that, though, you have a group of political parties and organisations, some of which are legitimately constituted, some of which aren't registered political parties, but have stood candidates for elections as independents, like the Irish Freedom Party, the National Party, Identity Ireland, the Irish Patriots, and Anti-Corruption Ireland. So these are drawn from the sort of the radical right of the political spectrum. Not all, but most of them. And that leads us to kind of learn that the bulk of this quasi-organized activity has its roots either in the conservative right or the radical right. And you can see from some of the images there, the reference to sovereignty. And at one of the anti-lockdown demonstrations, you had this security guy with an Antifa hunting permit tacked onto their garments and so on. So this will give you an indication of the sort of the populist radical right kind of framing that they use. What do they do? Well, they produce an awful lot of online and real world political ephemera. They do an awful lot of collective protests, and they particularly did this in the period of lockdown, even in defiance of the very strict 5-kilometer travel restrictions that were in place. They demonstrate often at very specific venues. Croke Park Stadium, the headquarters of the Gaelic Athletics Association. They had a big protest there at the Eid al-Adha Festival in 2020, when Croke Park was chosen for that celebration for the Muslim community. Because of its vast size, you could socially distance very safely. It was an interfaith event, very successful. But because Croke Park was so significant a place, a venue for Irish nationalists and Republicans, those on the radical right used this as further evidence in their opinion that this was, a plot to replace the Irish population and so on. These tropes were in there, but it was linked back to the lockdown and the pandemic. And they've also protested outside the homes of ministers, politicians, and allegedly, in some cases, attempted to discourage COVID patients from seeking medical treatment. There is a case which was well known about which we can talk about if you want to later on. So I've just compiled a kind of a slide here to give you a sense of what these beliefs that you'd hear from these groups often sound like. Well, in terms of what they're against, they're against the European Union, they're anti-abortion, they're anti-LGBTQ, they're against non-white immigration, they're anti-globalist. For globalists, read, and it's a very conspiratorial notion of globalism, and it's often linked to sort of anti-Semitic undertones. They're against the leading nationalist party, Sinn Féin, which is of the left. They're vaccine skeptic, they're anti-state control, and anti-NATO. But at the same time, there's a lot of contradictions there. So just as well as being vaccine skeptic, they're willing to embrace experimental treatments like ivermectin and so on for COVID. They're against state control, but they use a lot of surveillance tech, online platforms and so on. Many of them had signed up to Parley before the revelations of the January 6th fiasco in the United States. And they're anti-NATO, which they see as imperialist, but pro-Russia, which they don't see as imperialist, and they see Russia as kind of the last bastion of civilization in Europe, if you like. As you can see from the kind of compilation there, they're often described as anti-science. It's probably more accurate to say that they do value expertise, but not from the mainstream. So when it's from figures that they agree with, they tend to go to their credentials and say, Doctor so-and-so, Professor so-and-so. You see in the slide there, Professor Dolores Cahill, who was skeptical of vaccines, and the hydroxychloroquine, I can't even say it, the experimental treatment that was trumpeted as a potential solution to COVID. There in the slide below, the physician whose name eludes me at the moment, who recently passed away. He was a skeptic of conventional medicine. But key point here, even though it looks like they've spontaneously come out of the woodwork involving the pandemic, they're not. A lot of these groups and individuals have been there for a long time. And that's why I kind of refer to these as waves of collective action. And there's three key kind of groups and incidents and events which these has inspired the sort of the anti-COVID or long COVID protest movement. Firstly, the Great Recession, or anti-eviction activism, such as the Yellow Vests or the How's the Irish First campaign have come out of. anti-abortion activism. And here you have huge long-standing links between UK and Irish activists. You can see in the slide, the leader of the Irish Patriots is pictured with Jim Dowson and Nick Griffin, the British National Party's former leader, and so on. And you have groups which were involved in sort of traditional Irish Republican and nationalist activism, centered around sort of discourses around sovereign citizens and the lack of state legitimacy. And so some of the same people often turn up at these. So in the January ceremony that one Republican group has every year, where they allegedly validate the state and say they turn the sovereign seal of the Irish state as they see it, people like Dolores Cahill were speaking there that we saw in the previous slide. So some of these same figures and milieux reappear. So it's not as spontaneous, perhaps, as you might think. And to kind of wind up the post-viral or long COVID skepticism that I kind of refer to here is what has happened these groups since the restrictions have been lifted is that they've changed the focus of their protests. So it's not so much now COVID and the restrictions. What they're talking about are things like culture war themes, some of which are more conspiratorial than others. So we see anti-Semitic rhetoric creeping through, questioning of Holocaust narratives. That's more rare, but it can be found in some material that you see. The vaccination campaign has been linked to alleged depopulation, and because of what they see as the hoax of climate change and the need to, they say, of some people to want to reduce the population, and also the Great Replacement Conspiracy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. They're very anti-LGBTQ in many cases, especially trans people, very much at the fore of some of the subsequent activism. There was things like the Celebrate Womanhood demonstration, anti-sex education initiatives, and they've imported these sort of grooming narratives from that we see in the United States at the moment and applied these to Ireland. And they're using things now like the cost of living crisis and free speech to push their message. And these have all been, again, linked to immigration, to the sanctions on Russia, and to what they see as the hoax of climate change. And the Ukrainian war at the moment is a big one. They're very anti-Ukraine, and much like the UK radical right, the Irish radical right has always usually been pro-Russian, and we see that coming through. The Ukrainian refugee situation is linked to a conspiracy, again, to abolish private property and so on. I can tell you a bit more about that if you want to. I see Camillo popping up. How am I doing for time?
You have 2 minutes, Sean.
2 minutes, perfect.
Yes.
So this is just an example of my online field notes to give you an indication of the kinds of things these people say. This was at a recent cost of living crisis demonstration organised by the Yellow Vests in Dublin. It's ostensibly about the cost of living, but if you look at what they say, we can see that a lot of these themes that I talked about creep through. So they talk that they do mention the legacy of lockdown has caused an economic crisis, but that's only part of it. The sanctions on Russia, which they see as stupid and ineffective, are also driving these challenges for the Irish population. Climate change, which they disagree with. They claim that the hot weather is simply due to summer and so on. And here we see this particular speaker said he was no fan of Vladimir Putin, but if we, the Irish, had a leader like him, he would look after our interests. And here the crowd say if he would, we come first, and so on. And there we see the link to uncontrolled migration as they see it from the Ukraine and others. And so this is very much what they're at. You see these replacement narratives, the link to alleged globalization, and conspiracies to do away with private property, and calling at the end to stand by the Republic, this emotional pull of traditional republicanism that's used there. So in my last minute, I'll just talk about the prospects. The journalist Joe Horgan we should take them very, very seriously. Whilst I think he has a point to some extent, I make the case for a cautious optimism here. Why? Because in Ireland, the centre-right, for all its issues, tends away from nativism in public discourse. So that's one thing that might mitigate against the rise. The rise of Sinn Féin, the major nationalist party, which is sort of left populist in a way and non-nativist as well, has a more kind of inclusive vision of what the Irish nation can be, and is much more popular, and has been talking about housing and other salient issues that the radical right haven't been for as long in terms of time wise, and a lack of unity on the far and the radical right of the political spectrum. So there is a case for saying these are serious individuals, but we may not necessarily have a huge issue with them if we respond to them correctly. So like COVID, we can take protective measures, but I would argue that the state needs to be at the heart of such measures, and the political mainstream needs to take the lead in addressing these challenges. So with that, I'll stop sharing and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean, for bringing this perspective, and I really like this. How you're addressing this notion of construction of national identity, political identities, cultural wars for the case of Ireland. So I guess we can talk a bit more in the discussion time. So I want to give the floor to Nicoletta, if you are here.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi,
Hello,
Nicoletta.
everybody.
So thank you for
you.
being with us here, and you have 15 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Great. I will share my presentation. I will do it myself. Just confirm me that you see it on one point. So just sorry, just 1 second. Okay, it just I'm just an issue because I don't know why it doesn't. Okay, I will need to share it in as a PowerPoint because it's okay. Just so, or maybe okay, it's charging right now, so it's. I'm sorry for the waiting.
No, Nicoletta.
Yeah, so maybe meanwhile, Camilo, I will try to send you the PDF for.
Yes, if you can send me back. Okay, I think we can see it now. I think. Yeah, it's coming. Cool. Yeah, we can see it now.
It's but you can see already the slides because for me. Okay, great. We have it. Beautiful. Cool. Okay, so again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a sociologist, I'm an artist, and at the moment I'm doing a PhD that is exploring the common ground between body studies and performing arts in connection with ecofeminist education and decolonial pedagogies. So the title of my intervention, I will read it again for you, just to remind it, is Arts-Based Research in Social Sciences as Epistemic Activism in Post-Pandemic Settings. So I will propose you an analysis based on the Stato Vegetale theater piece case study. I will go already to the point. So I will shortly introduce a brief theoretical framework that I built in order to apply it as an analytic tool of the theater piece as a case study, and I will just share my conclusions. So let's go with a theoretical framework. I will just so that you can see it better. And okay, so there is art-based research is as a field of research and as a source of methodology applied to the social science is now considered as an emerging strategy in order to deconstruct the dominant research paradigms that are underlying the geopolitical and social structure that are ultimately responsible of the crisis, according to the interdisciplinary global arts-based research. That is an initiative of researchers with whom I share the spirit and and the same theoretical principles that fight and promote the visibility, accessibility, and acceptability of arts-based methodology inside social sciences as an act of epistemic activism and as a fight for social change. So I will. Okay, so I will just outline some theoretical consideration. I observed that during the pandemics, thanks also to theorem contribution, environmental justice have been acknowledged as the basis of for other kinds of social claims, and the epistemic and social mandates of imagining sustainable future has become a global need and an urgent need. Also Donna Haraway before the pandemics already pointed out that co-creation as the unique strategy for survival in times of trouble. And she invites also to make an epistemic shift in considering other species not just as our objects or subjects of a system, but also as knowers of their environment and also as creators of a new livable reality at the same level of human being. So consider that I find that this imagination action shall rely on movements and people abilities for radical imagination, which is the ability to share vision and to sense the horizon of socio-political and, I would add, ecological possibilities that animate and are animated by social movements. And in this radical imagination shall be, in times of crisis, shall be the common ground in which social movement researchers and social movement participants co-build a new future, because according to Ivan and Kashnebich, in times of crisis, researchers must not abandon this antiseptical traditional position and get involved in the struggle of social movements in a way that they would stop to appropriate their movements' everyday research and contribute to acknowledge social movements' role as producer of knowledge through their everyday research and practice. And they should do so by sharing their privilege and helping movements to amplifying their knowledge and to further and deepen it by opening common spaces for reflection and auto-reflection, which are normally very scarce within social movement activities. So in this way, researchers could really make a kind of prefigurative research that is doing today the kind of research that we want to see for tomorrow, that we want to have for tomorrow, against academic interpretation and commodification, which contributes to reproduce current decaying structures. So I would say I will continue by arguing that on this co-research between academics and movement participants brings to the attention the interconnection between epistemic and social issues and issues of epistemic and social justices, which are actually really interwoven. And the main principle that is influencing mainstream culture and dominant paradigm of researches is the Cartesian dualistic principle that structures our dominant view of the world at various levels, and that is presenting the human being as a superior being in virtue of his rational ability, and it is displacing and oppressing marginated collectives, including nature, on the body side of culture. So Cartesian principle is dividing the mind from the body and is putting the mind on the top of the body. So thanks to this epistemic configuration, we are having a mostly disembodied practice of culture and a disembodied practice of research. So why is this Cartesian prejudice problematic? Because it influences our way to see, to view ecological world and our way to interacting with the surrounding, with the environment. And according to Donna Haraway, is really the backbone of politics of sublimation and extractivist, capitalistic extractivist practices that are now considering the nature as a resource and not as a being with its own rights of nature and it's now its own ability of knowing. So I will just go a little bit further, saying that this kind of epistemic wrong is damaging both human and nature, because it's somehow discrediting the body and nature as in their ability as knowers, and it's making them as objects, is epistemically just objects and not subjects. So how to fight against epistemic oppression? So Amanda Fricker, who theorized first this epistemic injustice system, proposes that there's no possibility to equilibrate and pursue justice without situated reflection. That means that there are no abstract epistemic relations, but all epistemic relations depend on power position, on reciprocal position in power relationships. This situatedness of knowledge, of course, I argue that is not possible without an embodiment of reflection, because oppression is never merely an intellectual fight, but it always involves the body, and it always implies a physical endeavor in which the fight remains stored and absorbed by the body through an attitude that is psychophysical, and that is the one that contributes to reproduce oppression, and it is the body is the place in which oppressed and the oppressor contribute in reproducing and remaking oppression. So embodiment is, I will go to the further in the analysis, and I will present this brief theoretical context applied to the analysis of Stato Vegetale piece, which is now a mystery. I will tell you in a moment what it is, and how this theater piece can be considered an act of epistemic activism for environmental justice in fighting Cartesian principle, and in which ways it can contribute to art-based research methods applied to social movement research in environmental justice. So Stato Vegetale, as I said, is a virtual theater piece created by me during the first pandemic's lockdown in 2020, and consisted in a virtual encounter between human beings and houseplants, in which the audience was the main actor and participated from home through Zoom platform. The piece was presented in National Theatre of La Badia of Madrid in 2021. Sorry, there's an error there. And it was awarded with an extraordinary award to Creation by Teatro Lliure Barcelona, and made sold out in the first point. And was very participated by the audience. This the fictional framework, the piece, is that Charles Darwin, worried by the ecological and systemic crisis that was really patent during the COVID pandemics, came back to the earth and reincarnated in a houseplant in order to save human beings from extinction. Darwin prepared an experiment, both scientific and performative, Stato Vegetale, in order to invite humans to learn from plants' survival skills. So each member of the audience was invited to bring to the event an houseplant they had at home in order to establish a physical dialogue with it. The main task of the piece for the audience was to entering into the body of their plant in order to discover what did they think and what did they do, and to explore societal condition, the condition in which you are not able to move from your place, that we were suffering during pandemics, and that brought us humans very near to plants' condition. So the research question of the piece was how can humans change dominant epistemic prejudice towards the non-human worlds, and specifically towards the plant worlds, and how they can build a more sensitive attitude towards nature, but in their thoughts and in their behavior. So the Stato Vegetale configured itself since the very beginning as an act of epistemic activism, because it invited the audience to undertake a collective epistemic action aimed at changing both this group dynamics and institutional arrangements, because we were in a theater that was a public a space that are oppressing their nature, their bodies as knowers of nature, and nature as knower of the world. So the Stato Vegetale was fighting against this Cartesian epistemic prejudice by practicing a kind of embodied virtuous hearing that was trying to reload nature's and bodily credibility, lack of credibility as givers, both givers of knowledge, and on the other side, it was trying to acknowledge and maybe trying to fulfill a gap in collective interpretive tools for meaning making through the body and in the relationship to nature. So it was fighting towards the two kinds, biggest kind of epistemic injustice. Our bodies say us and nature is suffering, testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So it was ultimately resisting to the exclusion of body and nature from the general economy of knowledge. So how did Stato Vegetale resisted epistemic injustice through arts-based research? He practically innovated in artistic research forms by using irony and emotions as as elements that are intrinsically challenging for the dominant, serious, verbally based and logocentric research and culture system. So I see you, Camillo. Maybe it's,
hi, Nicoletta. Yeah, you have 3 minutes. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So it was. I will rapidly. It was. I will just skip the in-depth analysis, and I will go towards presenting conclusions. So, how Stato Vegetale was fighting? It was fighting in mainly 3 ways. It was fighting by embodying radical imagination and highlighting radical imagination embodied dimension as a cognitive and corporeal, intensely creative and utterly mundane quality all at once, by inviting the audience to copying the form of the plants and interacting physically with the plant. And it was defending imagination as an intuitive and embodied ability with a knowledge value that is normally dismissed by mainstream logocentric culture. It was trying to restore or resist to epistemic oppression by exercising the audience as an agency, meaning making and knowledge producing by through physical practice of relationship with nature. And it was ultimately including imagination as a collective practice and fostering imagination as a collective practice that is a process in which collectively map what it is and we speculate on what it might be. So it emphasizes on radical imagination as a capacity of building empathy and understanding empathically the other, that is strictly physical, as the mirror neuron theory had demonstrated, and it practiced embodied and radical imagination as a possibility of using a language that goes beyond the words and beyond cultural difference and facilitates interspecies co-creation on a same level and on a speculative same level. So thank you for your attention. I hope I am still on time.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and sorry for rushing you at the end. And thank you for bringing this social movements connection with arts and this piece of art that you are creating that it looks really, really interesting. And like that, I know, analogy with the plants and being during the pandemic and so on. So thank you. And I guess we can just talk a bit more later. Okay. So I'm going to give finally the floor for the session to Aide and Valeria. Both are based at the University of Cagliari. And do you have 15 minutes for your presentation? And so sorry for everyone for just rushing the time and you know how these things are. So the floor is yours, Aide and
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you very much for accept our presentation, and thank you very much, Camillo and Liana, to reschedule our presentation which was scheduled for yesterday. And I will say a few words of introduction, then I will leave the floor to Valeria, and I will be back on for the conclusions. So our presentation aims to make a reflection how social movements practice turn the severe limitations on political and social organization to new opportunities by turning social justice and care-based initiatives to build trust and solidarity. We observe on the global north and the global south that mutual aid and solidarity networks emerge in response to inequalities magnified by the pandemic crisis. So some reflections on the presentation of today, they comes also from an ethnographic observation that I and Valeria made for more than a year, being voluntaries on a mutual aid group. So our reflections are based on our ground on this experience too. Sorry. So we question how solidarity efforts respond to organizing food, soap, sanitary protection, distribution to cope with urgent survival needs and self-isolation. Secondly, we question how solidarity and mutual aid networks' direct actions distinguish their action from the charities. And third, how does a horizontal mode of organization aims to regenerate the sense of community and affirm a new social relations? And lastly, how does these direct actions set up an everyday resistance to finding other ways of living and relating each other? It's just an anticipation of our conclusion. Our reflections goes on exploring how social movements during the pandemic have asserted the role as an experimental infrastructure for social justice, and anticipating something that or realizing what something that Toronto said about the caring democracy. So based on our field work and the reflections coming from other case studies, we propose to revisit Toronto's theory in the light of the wave of mobilization, and to question if the enhancement of subjectives of solidarity and caring ethics of responsibility grounds a new knowledge to imagine an alternative society shaped on relation of care. So I leave the floor to Valeria, that she will introduce the first two questions. Please, Valeria.
Thank you, Ida, and hi, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for this fantastic conference. So as Ida was anticipating, we start from the first question, which is about how solidarity efforts respond to the distribution of food, soap, sanitary protection to cope with their urgent survival needs and self-isolation brought by the pandemic. And so we reflected on the several cases of self-organized and bottom-up networks of care and mutual aid that emerged during the pandemic and that engaged in a solidarity economy outside of NGOs' practices and of institutional practices. So in our research in Italy with a mutual aid network, we saw, for instance, the practice of spesa sospesa, which is on-hold shopping, focused mostly on the food box, which is a learning tool. It's a box created by collecting unsold and donated food, fresh food, totally outside of the large distributions, outside of supermarket, but rather using the channels of small markets and fresh food markets. And it's a box customized every week by the people, by the activists belonging to the networks according to the calls they receive and to the recipient needs, which might change week by week. So this kind of practice and tool, which is common to several contexts across the globe, is a learning tool, is an instrument, in our case, to enter in the neighborhoods, to enter in marginalized communities, to create ties and reinforce them, and also to learn something about social movements itself. So the first step we noticed was that the movement focused on creating a system of not local networks that provided immediate relief, but it also required huge organizational work. So this organizational work, in the next slide, we saw as both coming in some cases from pre-existing forms of mobilization. So on an expertise, it was already there, and it could come from other brigades, other squatting communities and experiences, from groups belonging to antagonistic culture, from feminist groups, and they all created a chain of solidarity and contaminated each other. But also it relied on a renewed wave of activist recruitment that reoriented the practices in the movement. They brought fresh ideas. So the growth of social exclusion and inequality mobilized both activists and non-activists, allowing members of groups, mutual aid groups and solidarity networks to recruit outside of the usual environment quite often. And so solidarity networks moved towards the social justice arena by acting against social inequality, exclusion, precariousness, isolation in everyday life, also making these conditions visible. And in this way, they attempt to challenge the dominant codes with alternative models of organizations and solidarity, which deliver a message to the rest of society. So in the next slide, we focus on the second question, which is about how solidarity mutual aid networks, direct action, distinguish their action from charities. And as in previous cases, for instance, in the case of social clinics in Greece, as described by Cabot, solidarity network emerged in response to crisis. And they emerge as a new form of collective action that focus maybe less on explicit political mobilization and more on addressing basic and urgent needs, human needs. And of course, in this frame of ethic of justice, mutualist practice are quite distinguished from charities because movements in quite some times, they have reassessed mutual aid and solidarity practice, which sometimes had dismissed or had negatively associated with charities, and have reframed them as an experimental space of instead radical action. So the infrastructure of Spesa Sospesa, we noticed the on-hold shopping, for instance, but also other solidarity practice, recast mutualism and care by especially resignifying community ties and trust, because they activated space of knowledge production through a network of actors that practice solidarity and prompt care, reappropriate care as an experimental field, fostering social, political, and cultural transformation in the territory. So they don't just conceive solidarity as a political practice, but rather as a frame for a new subjectivity and for a new political imaginary, especially concerning the post-pandemic. Finally, the third question we are reflecting with IDA is how does the horizontal mode of organization aims to regenerate the sense of community and affirm new social relations? So for many solidarity networks that arose during the global pandemic, mutualism means horizontality. So not being benefactors, but rather building something together, rejecting any idea of the activist or the people involved as a top-down donor or even as a hero. Since trust is important for care, it's more than satisfying urgent needs. Urgent needs are a starting point, but they are a caring step to build long-term relations of trust and dialogues. They lead to a common political goal, and they are developed week by week. So these activated, in our experience and also in other research, circles of reciprocity, where some recipients, for instance, become activists themselves, and the circle expand. And this explains why there was a politicization of non-militant citizens that impacted also on urban communities and their practice. We found particularly relevant the example coming from feminist groups such as Crianza Feminista in Mexico and Non Una di Meno ni Una de Manco in Rome, that insisted on care as intertwined to mutualism as an experimental field that restructure relations, that revisit networks of intimacies, that go beyond biological kinship and especially beyond the heteronormative and patriarchal models that put at the center the neoliberal autonomous individual and the family. So I laid now the floor to Ida for the next question and the conclusion.
So the next question is how does active direct actions set up an everyday resistance? So we observed that there was two different main topics that emerged. One was the net effect, what we call the net effect. So there was a development or local rationality putting together multiple particulars such as different kinds of issues and topics such as refugees, prisoners, precarious workers, women isolated. So it was a kind of mix-up of questions, social issues that should be addressed, and this kind of resistance was related also to the main idea to break the isolation. So the mutualism respond also to this huge need to break isolation and strengthen the correlation and renew practices in which activists reconnected with also territorial issues. So this picture that you see, body and land are not place of conquer. This is, but it was very strong message that different kinds of militancy used because they found it that there was a useful and meaningful issue that was related to the experience that they was living. So they create this new language of proximity and the bottom-up construction of share practice. The second issue was the healthcare issue. Of course, the healthcare issue, which was not only against vaccines, yes, or vaccines, not, sorry, but the healthcare issue was related to the expenses that the public health system was doing in terms of accountability, related especially at least in Italian revision of neoliberal health policies on the mismanagement or the privatization, so the cuts and the money which was not invested to save lives. And the other ones was related to the focus on state responsibilities on healthcare and to put pressures and act on this way. So the support on healthcare workers was quite strong, and slogans like health is not a commodity, or in the case studies we observed was less military and more hospitals, and we show something ways of art-based contamination that this movement did during the pandemic, because I mean the resistance to the pandemic and the resistance to military occupation of the land. Sardinia is one of the region, the space in Italy, which insists a huge number of military bases for training and weapon testing. So these militants, they call a self-production of significant message, and the body was used as a main vehicle because the body was in touch by this campaign with less military spending and more hospitals. So what this mutualism create? It developed an engaging responsibility, a culture of responsibility. First of all, building networks with people that was not connected. This picture is a picture that we took on the vendors on the main markets in the main city of Sardinia, which all these vendors was not only giving food, but was giving solidarity, was creating networks, new networks, people was getting in touch. So the meaning of mutualism or creating relations and networks and collaboration practice and inspire informal economy outside the state of the neoliberal logic, which was a very important and political topic. The aim was to create a gift economy that creates a community relation and prefiguring a huge political change. This is going on with what Bruno said before, the eco-utopian, this idea of creating relation was going exactly in this direction. So what is a caring democracy revisited then by this mutualistic experience? We think that solidarity became really an experimental response of social movement to the pandemic emergency in the direction of the free space, as Pauletta defined, to recast the importance of community and the collective empowerment. So the COVID-19 giving a rise to this sense of responsibility for a global community, which can be cared by each other and giving a distinctive meaning to solidarity and trust. So by this, the idea of Toronto to review the caring as a species activities, including, the way to maintain, continue to repair the war, and then can create a life as well as possible, it became much more important during the pandemic. So we question if all this mutualism create the rise for, or the need, or the wish for a caring democracy. So to reshape this idea of Toronto, of caring about, which some group notice and meet needs, or caring for, the assumption of a responsibility to respond to these needs, and caregiving, to be acting in giving care to others and receiving cares. Let me say that we receive a lot, me and Valeria, in doing this ethnographic observation was not for us only a research, but it was also a way to get in touch with people, to learn a lot about caring relation and caregiving. So it's not something that was just a general definition. So just a few words to conclude. If care is an ethical and political responsibility for every subjectivity, we really believe that the COVID-19 mutualism gave rise to this new idea of caring. So we propose that we can revise the caring democracy as Toronto defined as a new fieldwork interpretation of mutual practice for social movements, and describe a new caring infrastructure. Maybe this utopic idea of new society, maybe, but mutualists concentrate new ways to foster alternative social justice, and the circular flow of goods and relations activated by donors, sellers, and beneficiaries really creates a new mutual idea of caring democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Aide, and thank you, Valeria, for this really interesting presentation regarding mutual aid. I have just having some conversations with Liana and the organizers, and we're going to skip the break, the 15 minutes that is between this session and the other one, and we're going to take 15 minutes from the lunch, just to have time to reflect in the keynote presentations and, of course, on this session number 6. So we're going to have 15 minutes, let's say 15, 20 minutes to open the floor to everyone and bring some, of course, questions for our keynote speakers, for the people who have just presented for the sessions, but just to engage in a conversation, trying to interlink all these interesting concepts and notions that everybody has been providing this morning. So if anyone would like to start with a question for Aide, Valeria, Nicoletta, or Sean, or if they want to interact with Breno, you mean like let's try to create a nice exchange of ideas and reflections and questions. So the floor is yours, guys. So who want to start this conversation or with questions? I'm feeling like delivering a lecture during the pandemic to my students. You remember when you ask things to your students and you say like, oh my God, who is going to be that student who finally is going to save the day and ask something? And Kate is saving the day, and Breno as well. So Kate, if you want to intervene, it would be really nice. Thank you.
We have two hand raise.
Yeah, so Kate, if you...
Kate and Breno.
Sorry, Kate, we cannot hear you. Breno, if you want to...
Yeah, okay, maybe
take the floor and we can just check with Kate. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah, no, many thanks for all these very nice presentations. And I would like to put all our presentations in a dialogue, okay? I would like to bring up a point that I think puts my own presentation in dialogue with those of Gemma and Lev, but also with Donatella's and Geoffrey's one yesterday, as well as Nicoletta's and Aida's and Valeria's one now. And the question is, how do we incorporate biophysical and ecosystemic boundaries into our debate on critical junctures and turning points, to rescue Lev's idea? I mean, I think that the sociological debates about historical events, even in the long term that Gemma took, that marks a kind of before and after, either to transform or to reinforce that what we had before, often ignore the environmental dimension. And that's not a small thing for the present moment. It's now 50 years since the publication of one of the most important works of the last century, that was The Limits to Growth. And that report, that was published in 1972, warned that the planet had limits and little time to face this shock against them, right? Of course, the environmental movements have been reminders for these latest 5 decades about that. And the pandemic now, of course, along with other recent critical events, such as the heat wave, the water crisis, the energetic crisis, means that this debate is finally opening up to society as a whole. Of course, that perhaps too late, but in interpretative terms, when we think about the historical shifts that the pandemic marks, I think it's essential to consider this ecological dimension of the current turning point. And this is why the sociological transition policies I mentioned are such a strong reality for different and heterogeneous actors, from companies to social movements and in the states. So to conclude, I think we need to bring this into our debate. And I think we have to construct a stronger dialogue with physicists, epidemiologists, people working with human ecology, many of whom were using the idea of a tipping point that is closest to a kind of socio-ecological turning point. And this is conditioning and will increasingly condition political, social, and other kind of actions. We cannot ignore this. We cannot isolate social and political change from this, in my view. And this is the comment, the idea that I would like to put to our discussion, Camilo.
Thank you, Breno. Kate, if you want to write, sorry again, the question in the box, that will be great. Or if anyone wants to
I'm happy to read them then. I mean, because they're right at the top of the box and they might be difficult for people to see. So the first one says, thanks, Gemma. Okay, the first one says, thanks, Gemma, very helpful presentation. Came in a little late and you may have covered this. In South Africa, the big gender issue has been GBV, with even the president talking about a second pandemic. Are you finding similar references elsewhere? And then let me go straight on to the one to Lev, which says, I'm pleased you're putting turning points on the agenda. If I understood you correctly, you're proposing coalitions as the alternative/solution to rightward reaction to big movements of 2011-12, which were especially substantial in the MENA countries. But doesn't this depend on the politics of the coalition? In Egypt, a particularly tragic example, most of the anti-Mubarak movement ended up supporting Sisi. Divisions occur elsewhere too, usually with negative effect. Isn't the key issue about the overthrow of capitalism, which you raise as underpinning corruption and corrupt governments? So I'm a bit skeptical about this solution of coalitions. Those are my two questions, Chair.
Thank you, Kate. So if Gemma wants to provide some reflections about this question, and we'll give the floor to Lev, and we can just go around the presenters.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yes, thank you, Kate, for the question regarding gender-based violence in South Africa. So yeah, I did touch upon that in the presentation as being what's been referred to as a kind of shadow pandemic.
which I think is what you're referring to with your kind of second pandemic around gender-based violence. And it's definitely been an issue that's been picked up on in many different countries, and has led to lots of visible protests with women's movements, and obviously really exacerbated by lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, which has led to a big rise in gender-based violence in many different countries. So yeah, definitely finding references elsewhere to that being a really key issue, and a key issue that women are building kind of solidarity on across different countries. Would that be the main question for me in there?
I think so, yes, Gemma.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Lev, if you are mute, Lev, so if you can unmute yourself, if that's okay.
We can't hear you, Lev.
Yeah, almost. No.
Almost.
Yeah. Now we can hear you.
I'll try again now.
Yes.
Now it's better. Okay. As also Jeffrey mentioned yesterday, critical junctures can be turning points. It depends on the reaction of actors, political actors, social actors. They can make it a turning point, and this is crucial. And this is this difference. I don't speak about coalitions as every coalition is working. There are very bad coalitions and reactionary coalitions. The coalitions, Zaponte and Sisi in Egypt was a very disastrous coalition. The coalition by itself is not progressive or changing in the right direction. It can be very reactionary. What I'm talking about is about the relation, creating coalitions between social actors that are solidaristic and not basing their actions on hate and exclusion and so on, and with political party actors that are ready to build such kinds of coalitions. My point is that the political parties alone are not trustable. And they may become reactionary even if they have a progressive discourse. The balance of power between them and building these coalitions is crucial. And this is also related to Breno's question, because here we need coalitions, or intersectional coalitions that bring together different types of social movements, including for sure ecologists and movements that are making the main point related to climate change and so on. So and the relation to the nature, all this, but this includes also social groups like indigenous groups that have a very different approach to nature and are crucial, in my opinion, for this change. In Latin America, it's a good example of such a possibilities or potential.
Thank you, Lev. Anyone would like to provide any reflections or questions to Sean, Nicoletta, Aide, and Valeria, and of course our keynote speakers, or reflection? We have 7 minutes. Yes, Aide?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on Bruno's suggestion how include the biopolitical dimension in our frame, and I was thinking how innovative was Nicoletta's approach in terms of methodology. I think we need more and more to open up even the methodology, just not stay repeating the same approaches, ethnography, qualitative interviews, and so on and so forth, but using these methods and innovate these methods, because the innovation and the methodology, they help us to clarify, to highlight very uncovered issues. There are a lot of uncovered issues that we don't know yet, and these methods that might help us to make much more clear the new street of the social movements. I think the COVID-19 forced us to use this kind of methods, and social movements also. They was forced to break the isolation and to resist, to use alternative ways too. So I think really we need a reflection on methodology, much more deeper than usually we do.
I totally agree with you, Aida, and I want to jump here because when I'm thinking about these new epistemologies that you all are bringing to the floor, like from a historical perspective, for a gender perspective, for a geopolitical perspective, I think definitely methodologies have to have a central role there. If we are reimagine new ways to approach our field, we need to reimagine the way that we're conducting research. And it's not just epistemological, it's methodological as well. Okay. So I want just to echo some of what you say.
Yeah. I think we really need to change also this approach on action research, being actors and be researchers at the same time. Just let me give a short example. Just I and Valeria did a month ago. Since 5 years we are studying anti-military movement, and for 1 year I was pushing them to apply a methodological future lab, which is discussion about the state of the art of the movement, the problems, and the future. So they try to combine the utopia and the imagination, what the movement can do, but looking at the utopia with the problems and the practical things. So we had hard time to convince this group to do it, but finally we did, and they were very successful because they see the results. So we integrate this method with a communicative tool called Metaplan, which use visualization with papers, and we collect on the wall. So they can see in 1 day a lot of improvement for the movement because the issues was put on the wall and they had the way to reflect on that. So this is, I think it's important to start to share this new methodology. I'm quite sure that there is a lot of more on this direction, and maybe we might think a section dedicated to methodology. I don't know.
Yeah. I want to add, me and Camillo and I propose each conference, not this conference, but we have an open session. We can include methodological issue. And I want to share with you my experience with my H2020 project on radicalization. And we will speak about in the last session. Today we used yes, we can, Brano. Yes, we can, Brano. It's okay. We will do. Include an holistic approach that included the view of participants in the issues, in the different issue of radicalization. And it's not a research action, as I said, but is we called social labs. Laboratories very similar to your experience and the experience of Valeria, Aida. We include in our methodology, social lab is the is the center, is the crucial place with a different method, mixed method, of course, and participation. So the real expression of triangulation. And we try to include different point of view. And I think that Alberto Melucci in this can teach us, still teach us, because if I remember for social movement, of course, if I remember well, one of his best book about research about social movement, he worked in a similar way inside and outside the movement, to have the dimension of reflection among actor and a sociologist, a researcher. So we can talk about, and I think that we can have a RC47-48 session together. We wait, we're looking forward to the abstract after the call, and then try to, and we can also invite someone we think it could be a good presenter, have a good a point to discuss. We can invite him or her to participate to our conference in Melbourne. How you know it will be in hybrid form, even if I prefer to see you all, to meet you all in presence. Camilo knows I want to go to England, so I would like to, yes, I would like to be there now. But it's fine, it's fine. We have 17 country participants, so it's fine.
Thank you, Liana.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Just in the last 5 minutes that we have, I just want to highlight the centrality of the category of power that you are all bringing together today.
Yeah.
And that pass, of course, with methodologies, because as you know, any method is neutral. If you decide any kind of methodology or epistemology, you have to reflect with power. But I want to bring from all of you today, that from Sean, for all of you, it's really interesting to see like a kind of way of hope in some way, like we can change things, but of course how we can contest power in a different ways. And I want to bring that like from a historical perspective or a gender perspective, but definitely the centrality of power. And this is something that Breno highlighted really nicely today, and is how the pandemic can be another excuse to reinvigorate different ways to contest power, but for a new hope, imaginative. I don't know. I feel really positive after, I don't know, listening Gemma saying how women just catalyze different actions of social change at almost a century ago, and how Breno is saying like now is the opportunity for a new ways of geopolitical action, and left bringing, of course, this like a new imbalance of power and mutual aid and everything. Just want to say this, like I would like to reflect a little bit more in the future and how we can, of course, address this category of power from different perspectives, and try to address this methodologically and theoretically. But that was really inspiring, at least for me, and seeing like things like, for example, Nicoletta is doing with the arts, and so it's like a hope. I feel like The Last Jedi, like a new hope for us to try to change the world again. So I don't know. That's just thinking aloud.
So as Weber teaches us, we have to use a multi-casual approach, in my opinion. And I liked so much the Gemma presentation because it's similar to my method to social movement. We published last in 2019 a book. I could send you, Gemma, just to have a give you my works, and about the relationship between sociology and history.
Perfect. Thank you,
That
Lana.
is okay. Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I'm just going to pass the post to Paola and Lydia for session number 7.
Yeah, sure.
And I would encourage you again to just bring this kind of discussion for the next session. And thank you all for delivering such amazing presentations.
Thank you so much.
Really inspiring, at least for me. So Paola and Lydia, I know that you are here. Sorry for taking almost 25 minutes from your session, but we'll have, as I said before, we're going to take some for the lunch. So please be free to use 45 minutes to the hour you want for the session. And I'm here to provide assistance if you need. So now the floor is yours, Paola and Lydia, to deliver the session. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm pleased to see many friends. So we start this 7-session titled Envisaging Post-Pandemic Society in Multi-Layered Crisis, the Italian Political Laboratory. So we have now 4 presentations by Francesca Bianco, University of Siena, Lidia Lo Schiavo, University of Messina, Daria Pitti, University of Bologna, and Emanuele Toscano, University of Marconi, Rome. So we are all Italians, but the logic of this panel proposal was not really that of analyzing a national case, but rather of comparing different standpoints of research, starting from common cultural and political backgrounds. And by the way, there are many common points with previous presentations in different countries. Italy indeed has been one of the European countries more affected by the pandemic and by the lockdowns and by the, of course, the socio-economic consequences in terms of growing social inequalities. But yet during these years, Italy has been also a lively political laboratory with the contrasting effects in terms of collective actions elicited by the crisis. And so the neighborhood solidarity, youth and women activism, but also reactionary groups are the protagonists of the analysis of this panel. So I now immediately give the floor to the presentations. I hope it will be possible to save also in this case some minutes for a final debate at the end. I don't know if it is possible to enable the speakers to show the slides if they send them to you, Camilo, or not.
Yeah, I just want to confirm if Francesca can share the screen.
Thank you.
If not,
Okay.
I will be happily to assist.
Thank you. I'm trying to. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Perfect.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your invitation. And it is a real pleasure to be here to present my contribution. So thank you so much to organizer and to Paola too. And my presentation is a contribution on the effects of the crisis, the pandemic crisis, in a specific territorial context like the city of Florence. My aim is to analyze the effects on the practices of social relations and solidarity among neighbors in a neighborhood of the city of Florence. And I carried out an exploratory research in 2020 during the month of pandemic, the first month of pandemic. So we can refer to scientific debate around the pandemic because we know that the COVID-19 has intensified or even given rise ex novo to practices of solidarity in many countries, and the lockdowns define new rules that require people to keep a physical distance naturally, but they seem to have fostered a widespread increase in local and neighborhood social activism. And the pandemic revealed the irreducible sociality of the individuals that emerged through the strains of the crisis, and at the same time, the presence of solidarity behaviors in many countries. I think that we consider solidarity as a transformative and relational practice that emerges strongly in moments such as the economic crisis, the refugee crisis, the climate crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis too. So people respond in a certain way to the forced isolation all over the world by adopting new and innovative forms of socialization, which in many cases did not require a physical interaction. During the first phase of the pandemic, cities were more habitable, you remember, than before, because they were less busy, less noisy, and this at time led to a new sense, a new creative sense of community, starting from the existence of a quite widespread desire for community. It became urgent to think about the possibility of new forms of community life. So this is a case study conducted in the city of Florence, and in particular in the neighborhood, in the whole neighborhood of San Nicolò. Is a very central neighborhood of the city of Florence. And I think that this neighborhood is a part of the historical center of the city, is an interesting context. It's a sort of litmus test, because we can try to analyze the presence of the dynamics of communitarism and territorial solidarity. And the neighborhood is around 1,000 residents and presents too many identitary but positive characteristics. From one side is a very popular neighborhood with the traditional presence of working class population. And from one other side is a touristic area, because it was an increasing, it was a sort of gentrification process. San Nicolò today is a very touristic destination with most of the original population, many craft activities that have been replaced by B&B or BNBS. And my research was performed through an ethnographic analysis with repeated visit to the neighborhoods at different times of the day over several months in springtime and summer 2020, and 8 semi-structured qualitative interviews with 5 men and 3 women. Main results. We expected to find more individualistic behaviors in these neighborhoods respect to other parts of the city. We can say that the search of solidarity practices could be a challenge more than in other areas of the city. And consequently, we could expect fewer changes, less relation among neighbors. But these qualitative studies showed that local solidarity networks were often fostered by the existence of territorially rooted associationism, giving life to a combination of formal volunteer work with the spontaneous manifestation of solidarity, as Donatella Della Porta said yesterday, and practical material and emotional support to play through a mix of online and offline practices. And thanks to this, the participation in social movement increased. The virtual media, as WhatsApp, Zoom, or Facebook too, served mainly to coordinate activities and were associated with more traditional practices like face-to-face interaction. And the San Nicolò has a particular characteristic, because there is a street, a long street, who share the neighborhood in 2 parts. And we can say that during the pandemic, San Nicolò Street became a sociality space, an important sociality space. The experience of solidarity aimed at supporting the most vulnerable subjects, or people, disabled, immigrants, and mutual aid behaviors developed thanks to the insight of the member of local association, just 15 people, like the Association of Comitato San Nicolò or Circolo RC Association. It was an expression of left Italian party, who devised concrete initiative for the neighborhoods, as putting up flyers around the neighborhoods to announce the availability of home delivery or medicines, food, or installing containers to share groceries, books, toys for children, and singing in the street, or prepare a gift during Easter. and introducing masks well before they became compulsory, with the goal, as an interview declared, to make community, to recompose, to rebuild ties in the neighborhood. So you can see some example, the gift prepared during the holidays, in Solidarity Easter, or the containers, if you can, you can put it, if you need, you can take some objects, some food or books, and the dialogue, the interaction between persons, and also the word of mouth, a sort of verbal communication from windows. And it's important, I think, to underline some results from the narrative interviews, and in particular, I can talk about the territorial identity and the presence of trust, and the importance to rebuild a sort of intergenerational relations. The interview said the predisposition to collaboration depends from the flood of 1966, an important flood in Florence, and from the neighborhood committees that were an invention of the post-flood. It was a popular neighborhood that didn't fare well under fascists, and certain forms of closeness had developed. Or we collaborate a lot with neighborhood. We keep each other's house keys, as we used to do, even with the shopkeepers. The rule that were there many years ago apply a little. I don't have to do the rest for you, pay next time. There is a lot of confidence, and I think that is a sort of mechanism, of trust mechanism, that can recall the concept of Roniger trust, the study on the trust, from focus to a sort of systemic trust. And then about relaunching intergenerational relation, this man said, I'm 17 years old. There was a very nice thing at Easter, because Valentina, with others, organized a group of children to whom she said, let's do something for the people look up in the house. And then we got the candles, a scarf that my wife jealously keeps, drawing all gifts. And we thank the children. This is the value of the chain, and it refers, I think, the very important value of the gift between neighbors, among neighbors. And in order to conclude, this analysis, this exploratory research, reveals the existence of solidarity networks, which find the same root in the relation of proximity. They're becoming promoters of an anti-utilitarian mentality that recreates a trusting relationship among neighbors. In this form of solidarity, we find the ambition to recover urban spaces as a necessary first step toward reaching the goal of social equity in the collective fruition of the city. And we can speak about some important effects today, because this practice of mutual aid succeeded in generating a new interest by the inhabitants for acting as a community in urban spaces. New initiatives were launched with the purpose to rebuild the sense of community. We can, for instance, speak about the workshop of urban garden, painting, gym activity in many areas of the neighborhood. But at the same time, there is an important characteristic, that is to be sure to claim the defense of important public services for neighbors, like, for instance, the medical clinic. And in conclusion, definitively, I think that pandemic is Breno and Geoffrey said, they spoke about the practices deeply territorialized and the transformative possibilities of the crisis. So they spoke about the pandemic as a critical global event. And I think that this is very true because it's an opportunity to imagine a new use of public spaces in a more collective and collaborative way, but also to rebuild a reticular community as an exercise of performative democracy. So I think that the very important capacity of networking and the capacity to restart, to rebuild the capacity of resilience from one side, the importance of to make new transformative opportunities, and finally to consider public space as a civic solidarity space, and Camillo yesterday referred to this, is an important way to consider the effects of pandemic in our Italian context. Thank you so much. Here you can find some reference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Now, Lydia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. First, thank you so much for this opportunity and to share our research. I'm trying to share my screen, first of all. Okay. Can you see slides? I hope so. Yes. Okay, thank you so much. So I need to economize my time, so I'm going to read if you don't, I hope you don't mind. So my presentation aims at focusing on two aspects. First, to illustrate our research, mine and Paola Rebghini, on young people activism during the pandemic and post-pandemic in Italy, which has been analyzed by virtue of two analytical paradigms. Yes, I think, I'm sorry. Okay, now it's fine. So, right, two analytical paradigms, that is the so-called biopolitics and direct social action. Secondly, my aim is to highlight the self-definition process as generational units performed by the young people's organization we investigated, regarded as integral parts of the envisioning post-pandemic society. According to Sarah Picard, Do It Ourselves Polity is characterized by individual and collective subjectivation achieved by constructing path of solidarity, everyday engagement in associations and volunteering, a close connection between personal and political in lifestyle politics, and the relationship between individual and collective expectations in a context shaped by both the economic and ecological crisis. The latter aspect has similarities with the other interpretative model, namely direct social action, an approach proposed by Bosi and Zamponi. It includes various forms of engagement and activism, mainly in the social sphere, but also in the political sphere, and helps rewrite these two dimensions in different ways, following different trajectories, either linked to the social sphere. So our analytical journey through youth activism in Italy during the pandemic started with analyzing the National Association Up, Let's Rise Our Heads, which is both an association of young activists and a national network of local grassroots organizations. Up's young activists not only committed themselves to protest, claiming the rights to health against jobs insecurity and the climate crisis, but they also identified both a diagnosis of the pandemic and a possible way out of it that they envisage in terms of the society of care, as I will clarify further on. All this seems to correspond to the organizations and movements depiction drawn up by Jeffrey Players, since in the pandemic, these organizations protest, defended workers' rights, practices mutual aid and solidarity, monitored policymakers, and carried out popular education. But they also enacted a fundamental process of defining the situation, interpreting the pandemic crisis, its causes, and the ways to face with it. In these terms, Up's activists defined their generational location of the last two crises, that is during the 2008 economic crisis and the austerity policy cycle, and also in the current pandemic crisis, having been part of a great mobilization within the broader global students and anti-austerity protest cycle of the last decade that brought thousands of students to the streets and which was one step away from making the Italian government's bill on the neoliberal reform of the university to fail, the Gelmini law in 2010, that is the anomalous wave movement, having experienced the sense of defeat for having failed this objective, and also having had to cope with the consequence of austerity crisis and of the neoliberal reforms of education and the labor market, which profoundly impacted on their lives conditions in terms of the increase of both university tuition fees and job precariousness. They have decided to organize themselves once more to cope with the pandemic and to catch the opportunity to change their lives, to change the whole society. Hence, the pandemic is seen as a catalyst which has triggered further awareness of their generation condition and their eagerness to act. So the concept of generation has gained central stage in contemporary youth studies, regained central stage theoretical debate. I have outlined here some definitions of the concept that I cannot address now in order not to exceed the time available to me, but I would just like to underline the concept of generational unit. Based on a sort of utopian pragmatism, they have envisioned the post-pandemic society in their manifesto for the reconstruction as a concrete utopia, which is to be implemented, they state, through day-by-day struggles and solidarity practices. The manifesto contains a diagnostic frame, the nexus between the pandemic and the climate crisis, a prognostic frame, global and climate justice, the fight against inequalities, and a motivational one, generational activism. For years, in fact, when they were active in student unions, namely LINK and student unions and the Knowledge Network, from which a significant part of those who founded the HUB and actually of those who constitute its national board have come, they practices different forms of solidarity and mutualistic action, not only with the aim of supporting their needs as students, but also projecting this as a model for a fairer society, starting from the urban space they live in. Time has come to act, they explain, not only within local territories, but also in the sphere of electoral politics, both locally and in perspective at the national level. A brief outline of the methodology of the research. So as you can see, 20 online interviews, regular participation in the online meetings, one assembly in a blended modality, documentary analysis. This is the age from 20 to 35 of apps memberships, mainly online activism, offline activism, and 80 interviews from the previous research on, to members of the 3 students organizations we studied. So app is a national network activist, but it's also a network of networks. So you can see the previous mobilization and the link between these, the before and the after of this youth activism. So APA is a national network. Sorry, you can see also a lexicon that we have identified in our analysis, and that they use both in the interviews, from the interviews and the documentary analysis. So AP is a national frequent activist, but is also a network on networks, composing a sort of young people activism constellation. Don't panic, let's organize ourselves is an association, and you can see the map of this constellation, which is in an arch circle, the broad national left-wing networks of cultural association run by the Students' Union and Link Bologna, the Comunet Privators workshops, which is a mutual aid association in Turin, Spaßwasser, a social cultural circle belonging to Archie, and Nonna Roma, Grandmother of Rome, a mutual aid association based in Rome. So I'd like to show you once again the map. And the transfeminist collective Maleducazione in Bologna, the feminist network Ni Una Menos, and Who Cares About You, a former national campaign organized by the Knowledge Network that is now an association in its own rights, representing the precarious doctors. Therefore, we will focus on APP and on Panic. APP's organizational infrastructure consists in 5 thematic working groups, that is work, rights and welfare, school, university and research, the climate crisis and alternative models of development, mutualism and solidarity practice, civic city networks and representation. And also, as you can see, the most innovative element is the care group, a working group whose objective is to nurture direct relationships with APP members. With reference to activities organized and coordinated by Don't Panic, in the first phase of the pandemic in lockdown conditions, therefore online, activities were coordinated in a molecular way. In fact, the young activists of Don't Panic and Ritmo Lento played the role of a control room, of a coordination infrastructure, creating several activation plans, and also they developed an empowering approach to participation inspired to community organizing. The different paths were activated, including psychological support, activities in educational settings, and working with LGBT community. Deliveries of food parcels and drugs, psychological support, and combating school dropout were among the main activities of Don't Panic, and the various associations up to 50 and hundreds of volunteers of different ages, up to 200, that this organization of young activists gathered and coordinated during the lockdown. I would like just to stress this activity. This association also carried out this time bank, the condominium of care during the lockdown. Time banks were set up in several condominiums in Bologna, and with volunteers exchanging availability for taking care of children, the elderly, and owned. And then also the riders of solidarity, the young precarious food delivery workers were also involved in delivery parcels at home during the lockdown, with dual objective of implementing mutual aid practices and turning the spotlight on their cause. The map of the female marauder is the name of one of the mutualistic activities implemented in the context of Ritmo Lento Don't Panic in Bologna, in particular by the so-called Mala Consilia and the trans-feminist collective Mala Educación. These activists monitored both the anti-violence centers and the health facilities capable of guaranteeing women's health services. The maps of Marauders map indicated the address and opening hours of associations and organizations involved in women's health issues and providing support in the event of violence against them. Their mutualistic practices can be regarded as a manifestation of direct social actions and do it ourselves politics in a prefigurative perspective of the future society of care. But care has also been part of recent electoral campaigns as carried out by two young candidates for majors who belong to UP and come from the history of and is the different electoral experience on the territories and different territories of the future society of care. But care has also been part of recent electoral campaigns as carried out by two young candidates for majors who belong to UP and who come from the history of student mobilizations carried out over the last decades by the three student organizations that I referred to above. The two UP activists, aged 27, 28 respectively, Raffaele and Riccardo, ran for majors, now elected councillors, built an electoral campaign on key items such as sustainability, development and resilience, urban regeneration, social care, social justice and care. And in particular, Raffaele made reference to the notion of the abacus of care in reference to four main areas: solidarity during the pandemic, the shared management of public parks, helps desk for vulnerable social categories, and assistance from migrants, of course, as a issue during the electoral campaign in 2021. So this is the UP flagship campaign, is one entitled A Salary Under 10 Years Means Exploitation, the battle for the minimum wage, that is organized by UP activists and by the various associations, groups and organizations networked to UP. A battle which represents the demand of a precarious generation forced to deal with the conditions of underemployment and poor work. It is carried out in different territories where UP activists organize. Since the last 10th of October 2021, meetings, debates, scheduled monthly, have taken place, also with reference to the struggles for universal basic income, seen as another constitutive element of the society of care, meant as an alternative to the exploitative character of neoliberal capitalism. Yes, I would like to draw some concluding remarks about this generational perspective on post-pandemic society. Their understanding on the post-pandemic society is realistically pragmatic, having experienced how the window of opportunity for a solidary exit from the pandemic seems to be already closed, as also shown by the outbreak of the war in Ukraine that they oppose. The theme of utopia in everyday life and prospects for the future emerge, in particular around two key terms. On the one hand, reference to mutualism as a permanent testbed for reinventing the social and the political, and on the other, the need to enter into politics to fight for the young generation's need, this time operating directly within the conventional framework of electoral politics, with an approach that extends the reach of specific generational issues into the general domain. What these activists want for themselves, they want for everyone. In terms of their view of the future, the semantics of the future they maintain has changed due to the threat of the climate crisis, since the very idea of progress, understood as a constant improvement of humanity's condition, has been put into question. On the political ground, this means that the relationship between reform and revolution has also changed. In fact, the future seems to be dystopian, since scientists have told us that provided we will be able to reverse the course within the next 10 years, the future will be devastation. Thus, even an approach aimed at mitigating the climate crisis at first is not mere reform, but may become revolutionary. Therefore, according to this pragmatic, realistic yet inspired view, their generational perspective with an intersectional slant in terms of a society of care and possible concrete utopias scattered like so many different words in the space of everyday life, appears to represent the backbone of the approach outlined by these young activists. So thank you for the floor. You can see some references here. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Now we run to Ilaria. Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Can you see me or hear me?
We hear you, we cannot see you.
Okay, now maybe, but I'm not sure. Now, now you should see me also. I hope so.
Not yet.
I can see myself.
Yeah, now we can see your slides.
Okay, and you should see also the screen, and I'm sharing the slideshow. So first of all, thank you to Paola and Lydia for organizing this session, and to the whole organizing committee of RC48 for this conference. It's a pleasure to be here, and what I'm going to present are some preliminary notes on our research I am conducting on young women in ecofeminist movement. So to briefly introduce the general context of the research, what is ecofeminism? Ecofeminism is first and foremost a branch of feminism that analyzes the connection between women and nature. And within ecofeminism, it is possible to distinguish two main positions. The first, which is commonly named cultural ecofeminism, emphasizes the idea that women more intimate relationship with nature would allow them to be more sensitive to the degradation of nature and more aware of the risk connected to nature exploitation. The second perspective, which is commonly named radical ecofeminism, emphasizes the association between women and nature, arguing that this association actually results in a hierarchical structure that grants power to men and allows the exploitation of both women and nature. As a movement, ecofeminism is quite a recent history. So the term was actually coined in 1974 by the French feminist François Daubonne and was further developed in 1976 by Ines King. And the movement, as ecofeminist as a movement, started to develop initially in the US during the 80s. So the starting event is commonly identified in the Congress Women and Life on Earth that has been held in 1980 in the US. And the movement reached Europe and Italy only in the late 80s when the word ecofeminism starts to be used by different women, by women participating in the many environmental initiatives that developed in the country as a reaction to the Chernobyl disaster, such as the Forum of delle Donne Verdi, Forum of the Green Women, that was founded in 1986. So the interest on ecofeminism however, didn't really bloom in the following decades, and actually decreased during the 90s and early 2000s. However, recently, and particularly since the last 10 years, interest in ecofeminism seems to have revamped. But empirical analysis on ecofeminist movement and ecofeminist social movement organization are still limited. So within this context, the research I'm going to present develops from the ambition to contribute to an understanding of current evolution of ecofeminist movement and of ecofeminist practices by analyzing young women experiences in ecofeminist social movement organization. And seeking to achieve this general goal, in November 2021, I have started a qualitative research based mostly on participant observation and semi-structured interviews. So more specifically, I have followed the activities of an Italian ecofeminist network that is mostly active in Emilia-Romagna and Tuscany. And I have conducted participant observation in different events organized by the network, such as a roundtable at feminist and radical left events, webinar and trainings on ecofeminist ethics and practice, and ecofeminist festivals and camps organized in a squatted building that you can see in the background of the PowerPoint slide, in a squatted building that was previously used for intensive farming, that is located in Tuscany, so in the center of Italy. The data I will present will mostly refer to these festivals and camps, so mostly on offline events, and will also include 10 semi-structured interviews conducted with young women aged between 18 and 26, participating in the festival and camps at the farm. In the space of this presentation, I will try to focus on three main research questions. How do young women get engaged in ecofeminist activism, placing particular attention to individual path of engagement? How do they practice ecofeminism, looking specifically at collective practices? And finally, how do they interpret their ecofeminist practices, their ecofeminist activism, considering individual and personal meaning attached to this kind of activism? So, going to the data. From the data I have collected so far, it emerges that ecofeminism is rarely the first experience of activism that young women participate in, and actually it seems to be the evolution of a part of activism, of participation, that begins in other leftist and environmental social movement organization. And I think that it needs to be understood also in relation to these previous experiences. The interviewee linked their decision to engage in ecofeminism to the pandemic. That was quite surprising for me. I didn't expect that. But they linked that particularly to the first and second lockdown, that in their perspective increased their awareness on two different yet interrelated levels. On the one hand, the pandemic increased participant awareness on the effects of human action on the environment, and references went especially to the many researches discussing the connection between the onset of the pandemic and the disruption of wild animals' environment as a cause of the spillover effect. That was quite common as a narrative, especially in the first months of the pandemic. On the other hand, the pandemic also brought the participant to develop a more conscious critique on the unsustainability of the neoliberal model of growth, especially in relation to what they have called as neoliberal life rhythm. And as shown in the following quote, many of the interviewees explained or narrated their engagement in ecofeminism as an attempt to find a solution to these two yet intertwined issues. So this is a quote from an interview with one of the activists, and Paola says, "I'm taking part in the network since the beginning of 2021. The pandemic was awful, but I came out of the first lockdown knowing that I needed to recenter my life on my needs. So I saw ecofeminism as a way to take care of me while taking care of the world." So this connection between environmental and personal well-being is also reflected in the practices enacted by the young women participating in the observed network. If most of the practices do not differ substantially from those of other experiences of activism and include the classic, let's say classic social movement practices such as assembly, self-funding initiative, cultural events, it must be noted first and foremost that non-confrontational practices are marginal in the observed case studies. Indeed, for example, awareness campaign based on cultural event were preferred to protest and demonstration. And this, I think, is already a result that can be connected to the large predominance of young women as activists within this social movement organization. Another specificity of the social movement organization practice concerns the continuous combination of environmental goal and feminist method, which results in an explicit connection between the collective ambition, referring to nature and the environment, and the individual reflexivity and growth. As shown in the following field note that is actually from the last weekend because I was on the field, collective and personal goals are always kept together, also at the level of the practices. So I was attending one of the events at the squatted farm, and the camp started with a self-determination laboratory based on a consciousness raising method drawn from feminist practice. We have all been invited to reflect on how environmental exploitation impacts on us, and how does environmental exploitation limit your growth was actually the question asked by the organizer to break the ice. So in this perspective, young women participating in the research seems to interpret ecofeminism not just as a means to achieve a political goal, but also as a space where to experiment alternative lifestyle based on personal well-being. In doing so, they interpret ecofeminism as a sort of laboratory where to build a more sustainable society by building a more sustainable lifestyle. This was actually something that was emerged during one of the interviews I have conducted, when Julia said that to me, engaging in ecofeminism has been about discovering a more sustainable way of living through a more sustainable way of doing activism. Interestingly, sustainability is mostly interpreted through two different clusters of words. On the one hand, interviewees use frequently a concept of slowness and calmness, advocating for the need to develop a slower lifestyle that allows space for reflexivity and attention to relationship. So there is, in other words, a strong emphasis on a temporal dimension of sustainability. And on the other hand, the concept of sustainable lifestyle seems to be connected also to concept of interdependence and vulnerability, and to an idea of a need to build a society where it is possible to be fragile, where it is acceptable to be fragile. There is thus a reference to a sort of psychological, existential, I'm not still sure about the labeling, dimension of sustainability. So to conclude, the result points to a blurring boundary between everyday life and activist political sphere that has been noticed also in previous research, but it does not concern just the level of political practices, but also the level of goal and of ambition of the political participation. As political subject, young women appears engaging in a sort of practices of domestication of the political that, through the emphasis they place on the combination of personal well-being and political goal and environmental well-being, became part of their everyday life. In this scenario, ecofeminism in particular seems to be for the young women a space where experimenting practices of resonance, here I'm referring to the concept elaborated by Hartmut Rosa, who defines resonance as an alternative to acceleration. And actually, the young women participating in the observed social movement organization see ecofeminism as a possibility, a space where to experiment lifestyle based on slower rhythm. And also Rosa defined resonance as a form of world relationship in which subject and word meet and transform each other. And the young activists participating in the social movement organization have observed consider ecofeminism as a space where to experiment lifestyle where individual and collective needs are both considered at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. And so now, last but not least, Emanuele.
Hi.
Please, Emanuele.
Did you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me? Okay, great. I just shared the presentation. Do you see the presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So I will try to be very fast, as the time has gone very quickly. So the presentation that the brief presentation that I delivered today aimed at analyzing some aspect of the events that follow in the first pandemic wave of 2020 filled the public spaces in Italy against the lockdown measures in the first place, and subsequently against the vaccination campaigns and the decision to impose the green certificate, the green pass, as a necessary tool for every citizen to carry out their work activities or to go to public spaces, to attend public spaces. The two main analytical axes that came from these are the early findings of research that I am doing on the relationship between far-right organizations and free vax movements. So that I'm realizing through an observation, participant observation, attending demonstrations, and some and doing some interviews on activists about these issues. And the two main analytical axes will be of this presentation: the relationship between the far-right and the free vax movements, and the rising of a simplified conceptualization of freedom. The demonstration of the recent months have been a prolific field of diffusion contamination for the far-right, which has found a new and unexpected visibility and wide margins of actions due to the strong political, social, economical, and cultural, it might have been said some time ago, class that make up these movements, these free vax movements, and to the encounter between the far-right radicalism, the conspiracy theories related to the imposition of new world order by global political economic elites, but also xenophobic and anti-Semitic positions. In Italy, the obligation starting from the October 2021 of the Green Pass imposed by the Draghi government as a necessary tool for every citizen to work and to attend public spaces have generated a wide range of protests and demonstration through Italy. Some examples can be the strike of the workers in the Trieste port harbor. And I have a echo on my, I don't know why. Okay, not anymore, thank you. And the many demonstration that has been held in many cities in the months of September, October, and November 2021. On several occasions, the far-right party Forza Nuova, but also other far-right organizations, has led this demonstration in the name of a common opposition to the health dictatorship, represented by the imposition of the government about the Green Pass. These protests brought on October 9, 2021 to the famous, unfortunately famous assault and devastation of the national headquarters of the largest Italian trade union, that is the CGIL, by the activists of Forza Nuova and other group of the Italian far right, convinced of the responsibilities that the union would have had in the government choices regarding the adoption of measures to contain the pandemic against workers and their individual freedom. The encounter between the far right and free vax movement has been explained in some cases by underlining the convergences between the position of distrust towards political institutions that have implemented policies to contain the virus spread, the most general lack of trust in science, the populist narratives such as the opposition to political and economic elite, accused of betraying honest people, according to a black and white Manichaean world, which there are no shade of gray. But it's important not to make the mistake of reducing these moments to just one dimension, albeit present, of conspiracy and anti-scientism that denies the danger of the virus or attribute it to a Mephistophelian plans of global elite for control of the humanity. The demonstration simplistically define no-vax, present within them instance that the far right has been able to intercept by exploiting the social hardship and frailties already present in the vulnerable European and North American societies, both at an economic and social cohesion level, due to the economic crisis generated by the Great Recession of the first years of the new millennium that never really overcome, and the crisis of social and human capital that has been going through Western societies for some time. The far right has wedged itself into the already existing rift between citizens and institutions, using the pandemic as a peak for oppositional consciousness, fueled by a sense of injustice, even fear and uncertainty towards the future. With the pandemic, social inequalities, of course, emerged even more, and the social cost of the pandemic fell with greater weight on some categories than others. Distrust and insecurity have brought to the street many people with no previous political or trade union experience, a social group that French sociologists close to the resource mobilization theory define as primo militant, who have never seen their status, who have seen their status collapse with the pandemic, losing their job, being forced to close their work activities. The pandemic has accelerated the processes already on the way for the centralization of resources, favorizing e-commerce platform even more in the face of retail distribution, large economic financial groups in face of small businesses, the economic suffering of large sector of the population, fueling anti-political discourses and perspective that the radical right has been able to intercept and relance. However, it would be a mistake to bring all the, as I said, all these articulated critical positions related to the vaccines and their administration, mandatory or not, back to the simplistic label of no vax, without appropriate distinction, as often happens in the mainstream media. The judgment with respect to vaccine, in fact, reflect different instances, motivations, a position that can be placed on a continuum that goes from an unconditional adherence to radical rejection, with a wide spectrum of intermediate positions. It's interesting to highlight that how the distance in relation to the vaccination policies is not monolithic, but reflect nuances that is distinguishable in two distinct groups. The skeptics, for instance, those who adhere to the choice of administering some vaccine but not others, considering unless risky or not sufficiently tested, and the anti-vaccinists who oppose any type of vaccinations. For this reason, the terminological choice I adopted here is that of free vax, indicating with this term both the phenomenon of hesitancy and that of the vaccine refusal. In other cases, resistance to viral containment measures through vaccination is attributed, and more generally, the distrust of policymakers with respect to public health issues through the knowledge deficit model that is attributable to the Bondler report of 1985. With associated public resistance to scientific innovation as the result of scientific illiteracy. This latter position is very widespread in Italy among some virologists who have conquered the media limelight in the public debate, starting with the extension in 2017 of the number of mandatory pediatric vaccine. And then can be traced into a theoretical model that is called the linear model of the relationship between science and politics. A one-way communication of science and scientific content from top to bottom, from expert to the general public, who aim to overcome the presumed knowledge gap that would risk putting into question the public acceptance of science, leading to the what is called the scientification of policies. For instance, the use of science as undisputable certification of political choices in the name of a truth with capital letter, which cannot be opposed and which cancel the legitimate democratic conflict. I use also the concept of medical populism that I found on literature, and I try to apply this concept to my research, the relation between far right and the free vax movement. With the term, with the idea of medical populism is linked with a political style often used in the case of health emergencies that build antagonistic relationship between people whose lives have been endangered by the choice made by the establishment. So I took up this scheme, this definition proposed by Lasco and Curato, and I applied it to the rhetoric of the far right. And I tried to conceptualize this in 3 dimensions. The first is the trivialization of the risk associated with the pandemic. The far right, in line with the populist trend aimed at simplifying the complexity of the reality in name of the common sense, has built, its rhetoric around the pandemic, reducing its dangerousness and virulence. On the other hand, secondly, it dramatized the cost of the crisis and the social and economic consequences of the containment measures and their impact on citizens' life. Thirdly, it has sharpened the division between 2 large groups, as the populist does usually. On one hand, the people, the ordinary citizen, victim of the choices and the negligence, depending on the case, and of the political establishment, but not just this, but also a variegated front made up of elites supranational, pharmaceutical multinationals, occult supranational entities, as well as the migrants guilty of spreading the contagion. Very quickly, that's the core actually of my reflection, is the what comes out from the analysis of the discourses and the brought by the far right and the free vax movement is the simplified conceptualization of freedom that for me is rooted in 2 characteristics of the historical period that we are living through. The reflective late modernity, the radicalization of individualization processes, and the denial of an impartiality of scientific knowledge that is typical of the second wave of modernity that we are living now. The idea is the conceptualization of a concept that is subjective singularism. That the pandemic outbreak contributed to an individualistic radicalization of the idea of freedom and the intensification of the hegemony of the liberal paradigm on protest and on social and political criticism. Subjective singularism have two main characteristics that I took from a very interesting paper from D'Andrea. That is immediacy in the sense of absence of mediation in this case, and presentism, that means the denial of historicity, let's say. The free vax conceptualization of freedom calls for a retraction of politics and the collective, and cannot be questioned or limited in any way. And I see that this is deeply rooted in a neoliberal framework. Just a very brief conclusion that comes on. Eccolo, here. So as I said, this is a first step of a wider analysis. I think, and that to deeply understand the sense and the discourse of these movements, more empirical and close-up research need to be realized. First, understanding the activists within the free world movements, who they are, what they come from, and etc. The declination of the concept of freedom in a neoliberal cultural framework, and also how the far right changes inside their strategies and positions, their position about freedom, authoritarianism, and the role of the state that I analyzed in my previous research on far right. Thank you very much, and sorry for the time that I took more. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele.
Okay.
Camilo, I don't know if we have some minutes for questions, or if we are all tired and
well, Paola, I guess we can have 5 minutes, and maybe we can have just half an hour of lunch. But yeah, let's have at least 5-10 minutes if you want. Yeah, we can have a really quick lunch, I guess. Thank you.
On the floor to public if there are questions.
It seems that there is one. I can see a hand.
Yes, Geoffrey.
Yes.
Geoffrey, please.
Hi, Geoffrey.
Hello. Well, first of all, I would really like to congratulate the 4 speakers. This was really a fantastic panel. I would have plenty of questions for everyone, but let me just make a couple of questions to Emanuele that actually connect with previous papers. Because, of course, as Aide and Valeria explained, that we see a lot of mutual aid in from progressive movements. But Emanuele, in previous work, you also have underlined that far-right groups have also this kind of, not mutual aid maybe, but help and support to distribute food in neighborhood. And so my question would be, what have you seen during the pandemic? And have you seen something similar to what we have listened today by Lydia and Aide and other presenters have, and Francesca too? Have you seen something similar on the far right side about this solidarity on the ground? Because we like to connect solidarity, mutual aid to more democracy, to this, and which is partly true, and I also write about that. But at the same time, you work on the line that it can also go on the other side.
Okay, thank you, Geoffrey. Actually, I didn't focus my observation of these. I just focused on I wanted to focus on the concept of, I was really impressed about the way in which they use the word freedom, the concept of freedom. And so I want to reflect on the public discourses and the way in which they use this word, and the way in which they apply to their rhetorics and narratives the idea of freedom. Because when I researched on far right, the concept of freedom came very strongly out on the interviews and that I've done, but it was declined from the state perspective. So I was shocked about the way in which they completely changed the way in which they declined the concept of freedom against the state. So I'm sorry I can't answer to your question, but I am sure that where the far right is strongly present, it for sure would have organized some mutual aid as it's in its way of acting, especially in the suburb of the big cities, actually. I have a question that I couldn't do. I couldn't manage to do this before in the panel before. I see that Sean is still online, and it would be interesting to know if he found the same misuse of the word of freedom in the radical right movement he analyzed in Ireland.
Hi, Emanuele. Yeah, it's a great question. Just to come back to the last question,
sorry,
there was quite a few, a couple of radical right groups in the UK and Ireland started out the pandemic doing mutual assistance programs, community aid, food boxes. They were making signs you could put in your window if you needed help. But they swiftly changed approach when they found that the constituency was much more skeptical about that. So I don't know if the same thing happens in Italy, but it certainly happened in the UK and Ireland. But on the word freedom, yeah, absolutely, freedom is very much. Well, if I could think about freedom as kind of framed very emotionally, it's linked to oftentimes the War of Independence, if you want to go back that far, but it's freedom very much at the individual level. It's sort of freedom from rather than freedom to, if you want to put it this way, in terms of how they frame it, and it's often, you know, I'm free, whatever the consequences to the rest of the society, which at the same time they would say is very important to them. So a lot of sort of contradictory and mixed messaging I found, and I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's so much there to try and kind of get your head around that it's to try and kind of marry up the contradictions in some of their thinking sometimes, that I think it's a challenge. And I certainly enjoyed your review of the Italian case.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Half an hour break.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
No more questions. So thank you.
There is more question? No, I think no. But just I want to remember that Ilaria has presented to the Melbourne conference. I suggest her. I was with her first, but I had to leave because too many appearances in the program. A session about ecofeminism and young women.
Great.
So
we also share a session. I hope
nice
with Paula.
Yes. We will send you our session program so you can share with your colleagues or PhD students.
Thank you.
So we are also doing a panel in RC47 in Melbourne about radical right movements. So if you're more than welcome to participate.
So we will see. We all will see again.
Again.
So, yes, it seems so that just.
Thank you so much.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.
So
Thank
to read
you.
just to recommend. So half one, right?
Half one.
Yeah, half one.
Yeah.
Sorry for this short break for lunch. So see you half one. And
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 See you half one.